Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Black Solidarity's special IPSI Online, Defending Israel Against the United Nations. Our host is IPSI founder and CEO, Dumasani Washington, and our keynote speaker is Professor Ann Bayevsky. This is a regular Zoom session in which you'll be able to interact with the speaker. So during Q&A, you'll be able to either type your question in the chat room or simply unmute your microphone and ask verbally. Of course, we ask that you all mute your microphones until we've come to the Q&A following the lecture. Again, welcome to Defending Israel Against the United Nations. After this brief video, IPSI CEO Dumasani Washington will introduce our speaker.
During Black History Month, the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel will lead a special fundraising campaign to help us continue the work of strengthening the Black Jewish Africa-Israel Alliance. $100K,
$100,000,
$100K in 28 days. Our focus is IPSI's Content and Speakers Bureau.
We can only be successful with your help, and you can help us in 3 ways.
1, like this video on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter.
2, share this video with your friends and colleagues.
3, give a tax-deductible donation. Any amount helps us reach our goal. As a special thank you, we have amazing gifts for various donor levels, which include an audiobook and an autographed hardback edition of Zionism in the Black Church. From all of us at IPSI,
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you on today. We're so glad that you were able to join us. I also want to thank our coalition and our promotional partners for helping us get the word out about this very, very important and special IPSI Online. That includes Atlanta Israel Coalition, Combating Anti-Semitism Education Foundation, Club Z Zionist Youth Movement, Human Rights Voices, Pro-Israel Grassroots Movement, Stand With Us, and Students Supporting Israel. I want to just read the bio of our special keynote speaker on today and give her the floor. Professor Ann Bayevsky is the director of the Touro Institute on Human Rights and the Holocaust, a UN-accredited NGO, and a president of the Human Rights Voices based in New York. A human rights lawyer by training, she has taught international law, constitutional law, and civil liberties at universities in both Canada and the United States. Professor Bayevsky has served as both governmental and non-governmental delegations to UN meetings and conferences around the world since 1984. She attended the infamous racist anti-racism Durban conference in 2001, and as a representative of the international law, is a representative of the international law of Jewish lawyers and jurists. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Ann Bayevsky. Professor.
Thank you so much for being here, and to our host, and to Pastor Washington in particular. I hope I'm going to give you a brief presentation as to the nature of our meeting and why we're doing this, and then to give you an opportunity to ask questions. So I look forward to speaking with you all. The reason why we're here is because the United Nations has now launched the worst human rights vendetta, or so-called human rights vendetta, in the history of the United Nations against the state of Israel. I've been following the United Nations for almost 4 decades, and I can attest to this fact. Yes, Zionism as racism was adopted by the General Assembly back in 1975, but this operationalizes that lie. And it started in theory with a so-called emergency session that was held by the Human Rights Council back in May of 2021. And ostensibly, it was supposed to be about the idea of, there was a conflagration in May, which you may recall, and it lasted 11 days. And the UN Human Rights Council, which does precious little, to care or get involved in grotesque human rights violations around the world, acted with lightning speed, and 6 days after a ceasefire had already been declared, held an emergency session. Now, in this emergency session, they adopted a resolution which doesn't mention Hamas, doesn't mention the 4,300 rockets that had preceded Israel's effort to defend itself, but gives rise to an open-ended inquiry dedicated to the demonization of the state of Israel. And this resolution was adopted without a single solitary Western country voting for it. The Human Rights Council is a body where the majority of countries are not full democracies, and where the Organization of Islamic Conference or Cooperation, the OIC, holds the balance of power because it holds the majority in both the African and Asian regional groups, and those two have 26 out of 47 members of the council. So here we have a council whose members include such countries, such human rights paragons as China, Cuba, Eritrea, Russia, Libya, Qatar, Somalia, and Venezuela. So these are the countries that are all in on the demonization of the state of Israel under UN auspices. The other player here was the so-called, what the UN calls the State of Palestine, who together with the Islamic states gave rise to this emergency session and ultimately to the resolution that came out of it. So this resolution creates this commission of inquiry. The commission of inquiry in turn had 3 members. The 3 members of it were appointed by, at the time, the president of the Human Rights Council, who was a Muslim ambassador from Fiji. And she appointed 3 individuals who were on record as supporting the lie, the blood libel that Israel's an apartheid state, encouraging boycotts, divestment, sanctions of Israel, and the prosecution of Israelis for defending themselves before the International Criminal Court and other tribunals. So the UN has rules about who can sit on an inquiry such as this, and those rules include independence, impartiality, objectivity, and none of the 3 people who were put forward or simply selected for the inquiry satisfy any of those rules. And the head of it is a woman by the name of Nave Pillay. Now, Pillay herself was the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights for 6 years, from 2008 to 2014. And she distinguished herself in a number of different ways. Number one, she was a great supporter of the Durban Declaration, the lie that a Jewish state is a racist state and Palestinians are victims of Israeli racism. She herself was from Durban, South Africa, and she gave rise to, created and pushed the 2nd and 3rd iterations of the Durban Conference, Durban 2 and 3 in 2009 and 2011. So not only did she support the Durban Declaration and its lie about connecting the Israelis to systematic racism, she also, in the summer of, or in December, January of 2008-9, accused Israel of all kinds of violations, starting a day before, or I should say a day after the war began in the 2008-2009 war, of all kinds of crimes for which she wouldn't have had any of the facts or careful deliberation that a lawyer is supposed to be engaged in. She was a partisan player on the Palestinian side of the equation. not really an equation by the UN standards. In 2014, Pillay actually issued various press releases accusing Israel of, or just go back to 2008-9, she was single-handedly became the lead champion of the Goldstone report, whose centerpiece was that Israel had deliberately targeted civilians. It was just plain and simple a blood libel. Not that Palestinians had hidden behind or used fellow Palestinians as human shields, but that Israel went out deliberately to target Palestinian men, women, and children, civilians. And the head of it, the Goldstone, Richard Goldstone, who was the namesake, the head of the inquiry, in fact, retracted that central libel, but Pillay wouldn't have any of that. She continued to support and encourage people to think that that lie was true. And the Goldstone report should be followed up in UN terminology. So then in 2014, just before she left office, was the 2014 war, which, as you recall, not only began with Palestinian rocket attacks, but also the kidnapping and murder by Hamas of 3 Israeli teenagers in June of that year. And Israel found a network of terror tunnels, which were intended and designed and in fact used to try to kill Israeli civilians. They had evidence that the United Nations itself was being used with precious little pushback of to harbor weaponry, and pictures, videos, et cetera, but Pillay put out press releases, statement after statement, suggesting, not just suggesting, stating that Israel was deliberately targeting civilians. Again, a blood libel. She didn't have the evidence. She didn't care whether she had the evidence. And she made these actually wild, obviously inflammatory accusations as in her spot or in her office of UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. So this is the woman who is now in charge of this commission of inquiry. It's not a mystery what she thinks. She has since that time made speeches calling Israel an apartheid state, backing BDS, as have the other 2 members, Chris Sidoti from Australia and Milan Kotari from India. So we know what the report is going to say. It's due out in June. And the question is, well, what can be done about it? Well, the General Assembly had the resolution of the council, of the council, and before it, at the end of December, and the funding of it. And it became clear that it was a fantastical grab, unheard of in the history of the United Nations system, for money and for on the substance of what it entailed, and resources of all kinds. They have now, and the General Assembly agreed to it over the wishes and the vote against by the United States and Israel and a few other countries, which creates an in-house law firm, in-house counsel, permanently ensconced now in the Office of the High Commissioner, to criminalize Israelis for fighting back against Palestinian terror, and for exercising A, Jewish self-determination, and B, self-defense. And not only are these 18 people now permanent fixtures, part of the UN human rights apparatus, but the money is in the millions of dollars, 11 or 10, roughly 10 million to start, and $1 to $2 million $2 million every year thereafter in perpetuity. It has no start date and no end date. Now, one thing that can be done is to delegitimize it on many grounds, comparatively with how Israel is being treated in a discriminatory fashion with all other countries, how in terms of funding and resources, and for the biased, entrenched bias of the members of the inquiry themselves, but also to respond to something that the inquiry is calling a call for submissions. Now, interestingly, this open-ended inquiry, it's important to just say the UN has a web page, and in this web page, it has put out a kind of a template for submissions, but also, interestingly, a rule about the parameters of people's submissions. And it says that there are no temporal restrictions. Why do they say that? Because it was never about what happened in May and 11 days of 4,300 Palestinian rocket attacks or Israel's fighting back. It is intended specifically to question, revisit, and delegitimize the creation of the State of Israel. So this is incredible. It doesn't happen with countries which, like North Korea, where its entire population is, living in fear of their life and well-being and suffering day in and day out. Not countries where women are systematically second-class citizens, where refugees and women are abused in all kinds of horrible ways, from female genital mutilation and so on and so forth, to the Uyghur population of China, to 1 billion people in China without elementary rights of all kinds, to and so on and so forth. It's dedicated to specifically to a 4-part plan. Number one, to label Israel an apartheid state, which is not only a grotesque lie, but also gives rise to a whole series of consequences. If Israel's really an apartheid state, then it's engaged in a crime against humanity. Crimes against humanity are illegal, obviously, but in particular by the International Criminal Court, so make Israel subject to Israelis subject to criminal prosecution. And not just Israelis, but supporters of Israel in many different ways. If Israel's an apartheid state, well, then it's subject to boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, just like the end of apartheid South Africa. And lastly, to challenge the engage in an arms embargo against the State of Israel, lest Jews be able to defend themselves against decades, centuries of attempts at annihilation. So, but in that context, to go back to this page that the UN have said, they've said submissions, they're calling for submissions, and they say that those submissions have no temporal restrictions in order to go back and question the very legitimacy of a Jewish state to begin with. It's an outrage, and we can't afford to sit on the sidelines and let it all play itself out. What we need to do is to respond to this call for submissions by ensuring that the truth be told, whether it's biblical and the biblical relationship between the thousands of years of history between the Jewish people and Jerusalem and the land of Israel, the actual indigenous population of the area, and or whether it's an account of what it takes to fight back and how the real victims of this pogrom, which I call it's a legal pogrom, named after Pillay herself, really Pillay's pogrom. And so what we need to do is to respond to it, not with silence, not by standing on the sidelines and hoping that it'll all go away, or it's so absurd that everybody's going to understand that it couldn't possibly be right, but finally standing up and hearing and have our voices heard about why it's a lie, why Arabs have more rights in the state of Israel than they do in any Arab state. 22 members of the Arab League, and yet where do Arabs have more freedom, more democratic rights? The state of Israel, the Jewish state. That it's a lie that Christians are unable to pray in Israel, that in fact, if we look around, where are Christians persecuted? It's in Arab and Muslim countries, and by contrast, where are Christian rights protected? But by Jews, and by the state, by the Jewish country and the members of its armed forces. It's so, whether we point to Arabs who are members of the Supreme Court, ambassadors that represent the state of Israel, members of the IDF themselves, members of the current governing coalition are Arab political parties. So as means to debunk this nonsense about Israel being an apartheid state, there are so many ways by which to tell the truth, whether it's, as I say, biblical, on the ground, evidence of who the real victims of systematic discrimination really are. It behooves every one of you to put in a submission, to turn around and go to your communities and tell it like it is. You don't need an expertise. You don't need to say, I'm a special, have special expertise, or I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a political scientist. Your voices matter. And I think this is an extraordinary opportunity to be heard, to go away from this meeting and hear your, and make a difference. Now, I'm not saying that submissions will be taken seriously by the UN, that they won't distort what you put in, that they won't either lie about it or ignore it. But this is where you matter so much. You put in a submission, you can send our organization a copy of it so that you can keep a record of it. And then you can turn around and put it out in social media, tweet about it. You can hold a news conference, you can write an op-ed, you can put a blog. And in that way, when they do ignore it and they don't take you seriously and they do take you out of context and twist what you say, you have the proof. You're giving yourself a means to speak up. And I think that people all around the world can be energized here, in fact, to make a difference. And this is that opportunity. So I don't know, Pastor Washington, whether you want to go to the screen about how you can make submissions, or whether we can just send people to the humanrightsvoices.org website. If you go up to right at the top, it says Pillay's Pogrom. Right there, Pillay's Pogrom. You can just click on it, and it takes you to a page whereby you have all the facts. We update this every day: the mandate, the budget, who are the inquiry members, articles, et cetera, et cetera. And if you scroll down to the bottom on what's looking at the right-hand side of your screen, it says the word submissions. You go to the word submissions, and up at the top, it says it has a submissions template and submissions guidelines. So all you have to, these are Word documents, so you can't click on it, but they tell you how to do it. If you're not sure and it's too complicated for you, I think it's really simple. The submissions template is very easy. It shows you where to submit and how to submit. But you can ask Pastor Washington, you can ask me, you can send a contact up at the top there. We have a contact page. Go ahead, ask me a question, and I'll do my best to help. But as I say, there's a template. All you have to do is, and it doesn't have to be original, by the way. You see an article that matters to you, and you think it's relevant, you can submit it. Simply follow the template. The only thing you have to know is that your submission does have to relate to 5 bullet points. And those bullet points are anything and everything you're going to be able to think of, because it's all about, in their words, root causes of the protraction of the conflict, or any instance of systematic discrimination or repression. Well, we know how to, Christians and others know how to talk about systematic repression and discrimination in the Middle East, and in particular within Israel and the surrounding areas. So an article you saw, a video you saw, a sentence, a clip from the Bible, and that's all you need. You don't need to be able to be, this is not rocket science. This is truth telling. So thank you very much.
Professor, thank you. What I want to do is start off by asking a couple of questions. And of course, our staff is also monitoring the questions, both in the chat and I think possibly on the Facebook Live. So again, first of all, thank you for the presentation. As you know, as we discussed before, this is not being discussed very much openly in terms of what's being written about in terms of journalism and those types of things. It seems to be kind of on the back burner. And so the fact that you have been very dutifully sharing this information is extremely important. Obviously, for those who are here, they recognize that. I want to ask this first question. You had mentioned before about the fact that the submission, we were just looking at the page. And for those of you who are following that, that's humanrightsvoices.org, I believe is where we were, humanrightsvoices.org, and Pele's program, so that if you saw us kind of clicking through that, I want to make sure that you know where the start part of it is. And those of you who are on emailing the list will also send the link again as well, right? Professor, say something about the fact that Israel's detractors can also upload things, which is one of the reasons why this is so important, what you're sharing, because they can upload things anonymously with no verification or anything, and that can also be submitted to the United Nations.
Yes, it's terribly important to understand this is really a star chamber. And I say that with no exaggeration. UN gave a link to a cloud. They encourage people to put it in via the cloud. The cloud talks about anonymous submissions, and you don't have to give a name. And they deliberately say that they will not acknowledge submissions. So they want it to be as secret as possible. Why? Because if it's secret, then we can't examine the allegations, neither can Israel. We can't rebut them or identify the falsehoods and so on. And this is extraordinary. And they're claiming, well, we have to protect victims. Well, no, it's actually the other way around. What they want to do is protect liars, people who claim to be victims and who could not withstand the authentication of their allegations. But given that that's how the UN is operating, from our point of view, we know lots of victims too. I mean, the Christian world is familiar with the victimization and persecution on the basis of religious identity, which the United Nations says they're interested to hear. Obviously, the treatment of Christians in the Arab Middle East, it contributes to the, as the UN calls it, the protraction of the conflict between Israel and the Arabs, Palestinian Arabs and others. And so let them hear from you about what it means to really be a victim of persecution and repression and discrimination on the basis of religious identity. So the UN's, and you don't have to worry about, you don't have to put your name in if you don't want to, but where's the shame? We're not concerned about veracity in the same way as the other side is. Actually, we want people to know of our experiences. And so it's an opportunity really to hear your voices and to make them count. And so, and the other thing that's important to know is, given the open-ended nature of it, no temporal restrictions, and their call for, they want to know individuals responsible. Those are their terminology. That means that in theory, every one of you is listening to this webinar in one way or another, now or in the past. Once it's online and so on. Well, you're responsible. We're all responsible in theory. If the lie is that Israel's an apartheid state, then every supporter of a Jewish state is in theory, supposedly, a violator, contributes to the protraction of the conflict. This is a terrible thing, that this inversion of, right and wrong, of turning a country that was built, on the indigenous population and generations of people who have suffered persecution, to turn them into the persecutors is to invert historical truths. The effort by the Mufti of Jerusalem and the Palestinian hero, and in many ways, in his collaboration with the Nazis, to turn him into some kind of you want to talk about root causes? You can draw a straight line between the lie that that Jews somehow repress the ability of Muslims to pray, as opposed to Palestinians raining down rocks on the plaza at the Western Wall and preventing Jews from prayer. So it's so outrageous as to people to think, well, it couldn't really have any traction, but that's false. To do nothing would be a terrible mistake.
Well, but Professor, to your last point, everyone, I just want to just say this, and Maria, in a moment, I'm going to have you go ahead and choose only the questions that are there from the people who are participating. I just want to reiterate something that the professor just said, and that is almost like a guilt, she didn't use these words, but guilt by association. In other words, that if you support the Jewish state of Israel, then you are, according to this newest version of the pogrom, a supporter of an apartheid state. You are a supporter of racism, that type of thing. I wanted to give you a quick example. When we had this war that the professor referred to back in May, in which as Islamic Jihad and Hamas fired some 4,300 rockets, a percentage of which actually hit Palestinians in Gaza, which is something else that the media would not actually rightfully report on. You also had violence against Jews, particularly in the Western world, especially in the United States, in LA and Chicago and New York. And there are a group of Jewish young men along with their non-Jewish friend in LA. This is a very, very known story within the pro-Israel circles. They were in LA, they were at a cafe. They were eating, and some gentlemen walked up who were anti-Israel, walked up and asked them, were they Jews? They began to fight with them, and one of the gentlemen with them was actually an Armenian Christian, but he fought with his Jewish friends because they were friends, and they were all being threatened and being pummeled, right? So, and as a matter of fact, the Jewish men that were with them said, thank God you were with us, because we were already outnumbered, but the fact that you were with us allowed us to try to fend off the attack. Ladies and gentlemen, the reason I'm underscoring that is that these are young men sitting in a cafe during the war that Israel was fighting against Hamas. These people who hate Israel came, this is in LA, began to attack these young men, and both Jews and non-Jews began to defend themselves. It was as if it was an illustrative example of what Professor is saying. Here it is, this young man was friends with these Jewish young men, and now he's fighting for his life because these people who hate Israel are now taking it out on these Jewish men and with their friend that's sitting here. It's a picture of where we are now. We must raise our voices, because what the United Nations Human Rights Council is doing with Israel will also impact Israelis, Jews, and those who are standing with and supporting them as well. And we're talking about now justice. We're talking about human rights. We're talking about being able to speak truth to power without being attacked, without being vilified, those types of things. This is very, very crucial. Maria, I'll let you go ahead and see. I know there's some questions that were there and some comments, and let's go ahead and do that so they can interact with Professor Bajewski as well.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Professor Bajewski. I'm so excited to get into the further portion of this Q&A. The first one is from Louis Groover, and it just says, what is the view of the current U.S. leadership to this exact measure by the UN, and how is our ambassador reacting to it?
This is a very important question. The current administration voted, was not on the Human Rights Council at the time that the resolution was adopted there in May, and so had no vote. Now the United States is a member of the Human Rights Council, and I believe is legitimizing a body that specializes in the delegitimization of Israel. Their vote would have made no difference whatsoever, because all the Western countries didn't vote for it anyway, and they would have been just one more. So that's the first thing. When it came before the General Assembly to fund it, the United States voted against it. So they voted against it. So then what happened? Well, the General Assembly adopts a resolution over the wishes of a country like the United States, which is the #1 funder of the United Nations. The United States is the single largest contributor, pays 22% of the regular budget and more of the peacekeeping budget. And once it adopted over the wishes of the United States, it then becomes part of the regular budget. So in 2 weeks from now, February 17th, the United States is going to adopt the budget to fund the United States government runs out. The so-called continuing resolution runs out, and there will be an omnibus bill or series of omnibus bills to fund the U.S. government for the remainder of the 2022 year. And as part of that budget will be paying for the United Nations our UN dues. And part of those UN dues will now be paying for the Human Rights Council Commission of Inquiry. So in a week and a half, every American will be paying a quarter of the budget of a resolution and an inquiry dedicated to the destruction of the state of Israel. So that's the current position. Unless you do something in the next week and a half, you're going to be paying, if you're an American and anywhere else in the world, the amount will vary depending on what your country contributes to the UN regular budget, but you'll all be paying for it. So if people don't let their congressmen and women or congresspersons views or let them know what you think about that, that's exactly what's going to happen. So the current government has not put forward a policy position that they voted against it, but they haven't said that they will withhold the funding of US dollars to this inquiry. That's ought to be completely and utterly unacceptable. But so far, that's the current situation.
Thank you. Maria, is there another one? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's several more in the chat. Let me know when we run out of time. The next one says, why has Israel been so complacent and inept in defending itself critically, discrediting its adversaries and the propaganda they promote?
In this particular case, the government of Israel is not going to legitimize this kangaroo court by participating, and nor should it. You don't have three people who are dedicated to your destruction deciding, it's joining the this inquiry and submitting anything from the government of the state of Israel would be a suicide pact, which would not make any sense for the state of Israel. But so the issue becomes about you and I, about non-Israeli, non-governmental individuals, organizations, what we can do. And we see the problem. We know that it's a matter of, in some respects, the numbers of voices. For far too long, we have these small meetings and wring our hands and have been less than efficacious, if I'm putting it politely, in doing our job to talk about what's really a human right, what's a human wrong, and how this is an abomination. The other side has no such problem. And by the way, I noticed that one person in the chat said, can we put in repeated, does every submission have to be unique? And the answer is no. If you have a group, there's no reason why you can't get together and decide this is what really matters to you, this is what has to get said, and each of you put in an individual submission which repeats what your fellow which you think matters to you and your group. So no, it can be, it doesn't have to be new, it doesn't have to be, it can be something that somebody else wrote that you thought was compelling. As I say, it could be, given that the effort here is to try to claim that Jews are not indigenous to the state of Israel, you know, for those of you who know the Bible, know the connection between the Jewish people and Jerusalem, go ahead and tell it like it is. It's not, it can be as simple as a passage, simple as your experience. Maybe you went to Bethlehem, maybe you know other people who you know, have gone to Israel to pray in one way or another. Maybe you've experienced the discrimination of many different kinds when you went there, or the failure of the Palestinians to protect you, to make you feel secure, and so on. So anyway, the bottom line is it can be repetitive because it's your voice, and every one of you is unique. And so I just think, you know, more power to you. Don't sell yourself short.
Thank you. And you also answered one of the other questions in the chat as well. So I'll just move on to this last one I see in the chat, and then I see Marilyn also has her hand raised. And this one is in the chat more than once. How is it possible to make people aware that this is an actual existential threat to the existence of the state?
Well, you know, I mean, we can't afford to get discouraged. It would be easy to say, oh, you know, this is hopeless. This is sort of such a big job. How can me save Israel, modern Israel, from this terrible attack? But the answer is, you each make a difference. It is possible to get the word out, talk to your friends, get together with your communities, spread the word among other Christian organizations. And all we can do is tell the truth about right and wrong. If we make it more difficult than that, or more complicated, or give up, or think it's just too hard, then we're already defeated. So we don't have to go down that road. You do matter, especially in this particular context where they've deliberately asked for submissions. They've said they have no temporal restrictions. They're talking about root causes in terms of discrimination and repression based on religious and racial and ethnic identity. They're talking about the apartheid lie. The apartheid lie, as we know, is one which diminishes the truth of apartheid for those who really did experience it in South Africa and the legacy here in the United States, and undermines your true suffering and circumstances, if that's your situation. And how dare they tell your own truth? It's not your truth in the sense of it's somehow subjective. It's telling the truth in your words as to what happened to you. So don't let them appropriate your history, your religion, your experiences, and that of your families, and so on. And that's why you should speak out, because this is a grotesque attempt at historical revisionism. And but the only person that can defeat it is you.
I want to just interject here, Maria, as we're doing this. One of the participants that's here today is Justin Stover, and I was remiss. He's one of our coalition partners as well. He is an Israeli, and he is actually the founder of the Ghana-Israel Civil Diplomacy Alliance. He does Israel advocacy among the West African Muslim population. And so some of them may be here with us on today, and we'll also see this video as well, because it's important. Everything that Professor Bayeski is saying is extremely important for us as Americans, obviously, but it's also for the other nation states that are part of the United Nations and part of the United Nations Human Rights Council, that they speak truth to power to their leaders as well. And they submit those things as well. And then she's speaking about telling the truth, whether you're from America, whether you're African-American descent, whether you're in South Africa, whether you're in Ghana, to tell the story, you tell the truth. And I'll say this one last thing. She mentioned several times, even this biblical truth for those of you who are Christians, particularly pastors and those who may be watching this even on recording. Tell the truth, tell the scriptural truth, just as you preach it about in your word, in the word there in your congregation. Let your submission be, whether it's your own or whether it's an article from someone, let it be a submission about the 4,000-year connection that the Jewish people have to the land of Israel, the 3,000 years ago that the Queen of Sheba visited Solomon in the temple, in the capital of Israel, which is Jerusalem. Tell the biblical truths as well, as Professor is saying, as you are sharing this information, because it's going to be extremely important that they're hearing your voice. Maria, we have time for this one last one. I saw a hand that was raised. Were you going to call on that person?
Yes, I don't see the hand anymore. So if you'd like to come back up and ask your question, please go ahead. Or if anyone else has anything they'd like to say, feel free to go off of mute or raise your hand again, and I can help you out with that. But I don't see the hand raised anymore. So that question may have been answered already.
Yes, ma'am. Or I'm a pastor. I started talking and I either covered it or me and my pastor and rabbi friends, we talk a lot. So, all right. So I want to say a couple of things. First of all, for the questions and the participation, both on Facebook, thank you for sharing. Please continue to share this on your wall or on your pages and your clubs on Facebook. Again, obviously this is a live stream, but when it ends in a few moments, it will stay on Facebook. It will stay on there. So we want you to go ahead and share that, share with your church groups as well. We put the link there for Human Rights Voices as well, so that you can reach out to Professor Ann Baevsky's organization. Also, maybe more importantly, so that we want to demonstrate it. That's why I did it once more as Professor was speaking. We put the screen on there again, so you would know how to go to the homepage, how to go to PLA's program, and how to find the page where you would make your own submission. Again, your voices are very, very important. Someone said on Facebook, they were expressing their frustration, Professor, because they were saying that this is something that they were inferring that it's something the government should be doing. And we were telling them, yes, there should be more of a pushback, but here it is that we have to do the job. We have to do the job that's not actually being done. We can lament the fact that it's not being done, or we can go further than that and actually be active. And I thank God so much that Professor Baevsky is empowering us to do just that. We have the opportunity to actually make our voices heard in the United Nations, standing with Israel as well. So Maria, thank you for hosting and doing all that stuff there. Professor, I want to thank you again so much for all of your help, and not just here on today, but even in the past, the event that you hosted back in September at the 20th anniversary of the Durban One. and also the articles that you continue to faithfully write. We want to encourage you to continue to do that. You are helping us on the ground to make a difference and share this information, which is otherwise not being shared. Again, I have to stress, this conversation is not widely being had, and you are enabling us to actually have the conversation and then make it tangible for people so they can not only know what's going on, but know what it is that they can do about it. And we believe that that's extremely, extremely important. So thank you so much for coming and being with us, Professor. Everyone, I want to thank all of you for coming and joining us on today. I want to just make one last quick announcement as we had done in the beginning.